Hi, it's Danielle. This is my perfume journal where I document my love of perfume. So if you've been watching my channel, you know that I have been into perfume since the 1970s, and I will very gladly chew your ear off talking about perfumes from the 70s and the 80s in particular, because these were my formative fragrance years. I have Halston, Rive Gauche, Poison, Giorgio like coursing through my veins. And over the last several years, I went on a bit of a mission to find all of the vintage formulations of some of the perfumes that held the most nostalgia for me and the strongest memories, the perfumes that I feel like deeply attached to and are kind of like part of my identity. And I have managed over the years to nearly complete my mission. I still have a couple of vintages left, but there is only so much that I am willing to spend on a vintage perfume. And we all know that as discontinued perfumes increase in rarity, so do their price tags. And when it comes to vintage, I would not call myself a vintage collector. The only vintages that I've personally sought out are the ones that hold that like deep meaning for me. So for the rest of yesteryear's perfumes, if it is still in production, I will very happily go for the most current formulation rather than chase after the vintage. So buying vintage is kind of a risky endeavor. With the exception of the deeper ambery kind of perfumes, there is a fair chance that some of a vintage perfume's notes may have degraded in some way. Often it's just the top notes, so you can get through a bit of like rancid bergamot to get to a beautiful and very familiar dry down. And when that happens, that's wonderful. Other times, though, the entirety of the perfume has gone off, leaving you with like an empty wallet and a whole bunch of regret. And I would say that even a perfume sealed in the original box is not guaranteed to be intact. The quality of the perfume and how it's held up over time also depends on where and how it's been sitting around all these years. For example, I have two vintage bottles of my very favorite perfume of all time, which is Niki de Saint Phalle from 1982. I have one bottle that I purchased secondhand, and it's an atomizer spray, and it is in terrible condition. It's completely gone off. It's unwearable. And then I have another bottle that's a splash bottle that I just decant into little atomizers. And that bottle is in absolutely perfect condition. The person that I purchased it from is an avid vintage collector. He was just looking to get rid of some of his collection, and so he passed that one on to me. And every single note is exactly as I remember smelling it 40 something years ago. So anyway, once I picked up my last bottle of vintage perfume from my past, the ones that I could afford, I was kind of done chasing vintage. Caveat, if I ever find a bottle of Donna Karan's Black Swan or Ralph Lauren's Lauren, or if I stumble on like a real vintage gem without having to take out a second mortgage, I will go on my vintage purchasing reunion tour. But until then, I am very, very satisfied with my vintage collection as it is. But the call to vintage perfumes or vintage style perfumes, it's always there. I love a big, screaming, loud floral. I love a deep, growly amber perfume. I love a filthy musk. I love when perfumes were not overdosed with woody ambers and buckets of ambroxan. And the good news is that those perfumes are still out there, and they are being created by some of the most interesting brands and wonderful perfumers. So if you love vintage style perfumes and you are looking for perfumes that are kind of like a departure from the mainstream and give you that old school vibe, I have got some great recommendations for you in this video. Okay, so let's start with one of the first brands that made me realize that creating old school style perfumery in the modern era was a possibility, and that doing it very, very well was also possible, and it is Eris Parfums. Eris is an independent brand. It's founded by a woman named Barbara Herman, and if you have been kind of like around FragCom for a while, you might know that Barbara is very well known for her expertise on vintage perfumes in particular. She wrote this amazing blog once upon a time called Yesterday's Perfume. She is also the author of a very beloved book called Scent and Subversion, which is out of production, but she did put a poll on her Instagram where she asked if she self-published the book again, would we buy it? Easiest yes button I have ever pressed on the internet because I missed out on purchasing that book during its first run. And Eris Parfums is Barbara's love letter to vintage perfumes. In envisioning and creating this brand, she partnered with the master perfumer Antoine Lee to bring her vision of a vintage-inspired perfume line for the modern consumer to life. And in my opinion, she succeeded in every single sense of the word. I purchased a sample set from Eris, and I was totally entranced by what this line offered. So the line includes perfumes like Green Spell, which is a super green, rich in violet leaf, galbanum, tomato leaf, fig, and blackcurrant scent. It smells like exactly what the 70s ordered. There is Mabette, which is a stunning floral animalic that is so raunchy. A single spray of it could make you blush. There is Mix, which is a deliciously sumptuous spicy cocoa. It's a modern day amber of sorts. It's warm and enveloping and smooth, and everything about that perfume just kind of like melts into your skin. So all of these perfumes in the collection and many, many more, from the moment I smelled them, my vintage loving heart just soared. And I found myself in this like selection paralysis. Like, which one do I possibly choose? Which one would I add to my collection? They're all amazing. And in the end, I chose the one that doesn't really smell like anything else I own in vintage form, and that one is Delta of Venus. I chose it because if a fruity perfume had been popular in the 70s, I feel like Delta of Venus would have been that perfume. And that's because it is a super green guava with an extra hit of galbanum to up the greenness. And then there's this like jasmine snake sort of slithering through this guava garden. I think Eris pushes today's perfume enthusiasts to appreciate the perfumes that walked so other perfumes could run. And Eris reminds us of the quality that is still possible with today's available and allowable and ethical ingredients. So I adore Eris Parfums. Delta of Venus and Mix are by far my two favorites in the entire line. Okay, so next is a brand that I don't really hear talked about too much, but they make some really excellent perfumes in a vintage style. And the brand is called 1907. It is an independent brand born out of one woman's very clear vision to create a perfume brand in honor of her grandmother, who was born in 1907. And her grandmother used to make scented soaps and lotions by hand, and it's one of her fondest memories. So Eva, the brand owner, wanted to create a small batch kind of brand that focused on time-honored traditions and scent memories that she credits to her grandmother. So in the Beneath the Surface collection from 1907, there are 8 perfumes that to me conjure immediate associations to perfumes that we've smelled from like decades before. And the one that I'll talk about today is called Dame d'Or. Though I don't have a bottle of this, I have gone through my entire sample. It is a gorgeous, humongous, aldehydic, spicy floral, and it's all resting on a bed of woody animalic musks with just a touch of vanilla. It is like the big yellow white floral compositions of the 80s that have been reincarnated. And I would say that this line, this Beneath the Surface line, is primarily these like neo-vintage style florals. There's a fruity floral, a musky floral, aldehydic, spicy, and then the line also includes 2 spicy ambers. It's all there. Beautiful bottles too, adorned with this golden fleur-de-lis. So 1907 is a brand that I think is doing some really interesting neo-vintage, modern vintage compositions. Okay, so next is Zoologist. For many years, Zoologist has been kind of like pushing the boundaries of what perfume can be. And in so many of their compositions, I pick up unmistakable vintage vibes. I have said this before about Zoologist. Victor Wong, the brand owner, he dreamed up one of the most innovative ideas in perfume histories, which was to craft an entire zoo of perfumes based on animals. Their environments, their diets, their bodies, their habits, everything about the animal distilled into a scent. And each animal's fragrance profile is represented by an individual perfumer who conceptualizes what this animal would smell like if it were a fragrance. The whole concept is just brilliant. And so in the Zoologist line, you have compositions that could be tagged to many decades of perfumery in their style and in their structure. And one of the best examples of one that I think represents like a neo-vintage or modern vintage composition is Nightingale. So Nightingale was composed by perfumer Tomu Inaba, who, by the way, has one of the most impressive perfume collections of his own that I have ever seen. His Instagram page is like one gorgeous photo after another of perfumes from every single decade, from vintage to modern. So it is no wonder that his own perfumery reflects the depth of perfume knowledge and experience that he has. So Nightingale is this gorgeous floral chypre. And actually, while we're on the topic of chypres, this style of perfume has a very long-standing history. Lots of people regard the original Coty chypre as like the sourdough starter of this type of perfume, if you will. So the Coty chypre followed the structure of the citrusy top note. So in the case of that perfume, it was bergamot, a heart of balsamic labdanum with florals like rose and jasmine and iris, and then a deep mossy base. And the oak moss is the ingredient that is kind of like the signature stamp of all chypres. There's other stuff going on, but that is the general structure of a chypre. And probably the most famous chypre of all time is Jacques Guerlain's Mitsuko from 1919. And what made Mitsuko so innovative was the use of an aldehyde that gave a peachiness to the composition, a fruitiness that elevated the fragrance with an elegance and a lightness that just enhances the chypre structure so beautifully. And so on and on and on, the chypre style has been imagined and reimagined in like thousands and thousands of ways over the years. And in Nightingale, Tomu Inaba has composed a chypre with a lemony bergamot top, a floral heart that features a really interesting plum blossom note, which is a little bit sour, along with a waxy, lipsticky rose violet. And then in the base, you have those traditional chypre elements like oak moss, patchouli, labdanum. Once you've smelled a chypre, and if you haven't yet, this would be one of those styles I would recommend going to find a handful of samples of and smelling them in isolation, because it will very much train your nose to appreciate what makes a chypre and what makes each chypre unique. Anyway, with Nightingale, you do get this feeling that the perfume is kind of like the sound of a songbird. It's got a little bit of like a yin and yang to it. Like to me, birdsong is a little bit uplifting and sweet and happy to hear, but there is also something kind of melancholy about the sounds of birds. I can't really explain why that is. That's just how it registers with me. And this perfume registers in the same way. I find it so beautiful. There is something sort of uplifting and pretty feeling about it, but there's also something like a little bit melancholy and maybe a little bit sad about this perfume. It sort of feels like something you discovered on your grandmother's dresser once upon a time, and it gives you both happy and sad memories or feelings. And I think that's what I love so much about this perfume, is just how evocative of a chypre style this is. Okay, even though this brand has been around for a little while, it's kind of a recent discovery for me. Only in the last year have I discovered Parfum d'Empire. The founder, brand owner, and perfumer, Marc-Antoine Corticchiato, to my understanding, has a PhD in chemistry, which I think makes him like uniquely positioned to be a perfumer, because so much of perfumery is chemistry. Understanding the ways in which molecules react to one another. This is the most like simplistic way I can describe it. You can kind of sense all of this in his work, in his perfumes. They do not smell artificial. They smell like all of the wonderful and often now restricted natural ingredients in their purest form. That's what it smells like he uses in his perfumes. And I'm sure he uses tons of synthetics, but he's just such an excellent chemist that his compositions smell entirely natural. Now, I have only smelled maybe 4 or 5 perfumes from his extremely robust line of scents, but every single one has been magnificent, spectacular. And most recently, I was treated to this sample of Un Bel Amour d'été. And as I said in a recent video, when I smelled this perfume, something just clicked inside of me. This is the kind of perfume that just speaks to my whole entire soul. Not just the fact that it is a style of perfume that I love, a modern, vintage, golden yellow floral with lots of like indolic skank running through it, this big, round, voluptuous, shimmering frag, but it also speaks to me because it reminds me of how a really good, really well-crafted perfume can make a perfume lover feel. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not a perfume snob. I have plenty of $9 bargains in my collection, or have had $9 bargains in my collection that smell amazing, and I will continue to shout the virtues of those affordable gems from the rooftops. But there is like no denying the quality and the craftsmanship of a perfume like Un Bel Amour d'été. Just, you can't. It makes me feel the kind of feels that I got when I first smelled Isatis and Nikki de St. Phalle and Halston and Lauren. The feeling that a perfume is a way of expressing yourself, expressing all of your complex moods, your emotions, your stages of life. Sometimes I definitely just want to smell good, but sometimes I want my perfumes to evoke a feeling of like, wow, I just smelled something really, really special. And this is one of those perfumes. Okay, also in the artisan perfume world, there are 2 perfumers that I think are notable for creating perfumes in a vintage style. So the first is Liz Morris, and her brand is called Papillon. And I first discovered Papillon when I was given a sample of Hera at a perfume shop, and this perfume was like love at first sniff. Hera was created by Liz for her daughter to wear at her wedding, and it is a gorgeous old school bouquet of flowers. It has narcissus, iris, jasmine, rose, orange blossom, ylang ylang, and then it has this incredibly gorgeous, fluffy, romantic musk that just wraps the bouquet of flowers in a big, thick velvet bow. Now, I eloped, but if I had had an actual wedding, this is probably the perfume I would have wanted to wear. It is everything that you would want to stand out uniquely on one of the most important days of your life. It is powdery and fluffy, but it is not shy at all. It is bold and confident, and it has the little bit of like, what is that underneath it all? Something sort of mysterious that keeps it from being just like your everyday musky floral. It is gorgeous, and so many of Papillon's creations, they definitely have that old school vintagey quality to them. So next is a perfumer that I have mentioned many times on my channel, and that's Darren Allen. So Darren's work is unmistakably vintage smelling. He has this wonderful Scent of the Month subscription. I think it's like $25 a month for a 10 ml surprise to come to your door. And I had subscribed to this for a while, and it was so fabulous. Every month you'd get a new perfume, often focused around a singular note or an interesting composition like these, rose geranium and spiced amber. One of my favorites was Trailing Arbutus, which is a now public formula from the California Perfume Company that went on to become Avon, recreated with currently available materials. So Darren, in his library of creations, has chypres, lipsticky florals, ambers, greens, gourmands, musk. You can sense a hat tip to the classics in everything that he creates with his own like artistic spin on it. And 2 of his perfumes, Chypre No. 1 and Songe à Fleur, are extremely well respected as some of the best examples of vintage styles translated into modern perfumery. And on top of it all, Darren is just a really, really lovely person. I have mentioned before that he used to offer perfumery courses over Zoom, and I took his entire series of classes and I learned so much. Smelling raw materials, learning to analyze them, learning to understand their sources, where they come from, their structures, their nuances. And then we concluded the series by learning to construct simple accords that you could then use to like tinker with and making actual perfumes. I loved learning about perfumes from him. He is an excellent teacher, and his perfumes just really exude the love and the respect that he has for the art and craft of perfumery. So now let's talk about some of the revival brands. Now, not all revival brands are creating vintage style perfumes. In fact, I would say that some acquisitions of heritage brands have kind of done the opposite, but many revival brands are kind of recreating vintage style perfumes, or at least reimagining them. And these are a few of my favorites. I'm not going to go into like too much detail here because sneak peek, one of our upcoming sniff-alongs is going to be all revival brand perfumes. So we'll start with Grossmith. So Grossmith was founded in 1835. It had a long history of creating very well-respected perfumes. And then sometime along the way, the brand, like many brands of its kind, went dormant. And I think what makes Grossmith interesting is that it was revived in 2006 by an actual member of the Grossmith family. So the brand remains in family hands to this day. And so every detail of this brand is intended to breathe new life into it while giving a strong nod to everything that it was historically, from the formulas to the bottle designs. And 3 of their perfumes are accurate recreations of their original formulas. But some of my favorites from Grossmith are the more modern compositions. There is one called Golden Chypre. It is a classic Chypre that leans into spicy elements like nutmeg and cardamom with a big dose of labdanum. It's beautiful stuff. And I also love their floral called Betrothal, which is a really classic, musky, lush rose jasmine perfume. Their compositions are excellent. Okay, then we have Bienaimé. This is a perfume that I discovered once upon a time on vacation. I was immediately drawn to these gorgeous Art Deco bottles and the display that they were in, and the actual perfumes themselves did not disappoint at all. This is the namesake brand of Robert Bienaimé, who was the head perfumer for Houbigant before he launched this house, his own house, in 1935. And this is another one of those brands that went kind of like dormant until after the current owner, Cecilia Mergui, discovered a vintage Bienaimé cosmetic compact at a flea market. And she went down a research rabbit hole, and boom, this classic perfume brand was revived in 2021. I have talked about my favorite perfume from this brand before, Vermeil, which is a powdery lipstick scent. It smells like you twisted up a waxy vintage lipstick from one of those like fluted gold tubes and you just breathed in its scent. These are wonderful vintage inspired perfumes. Next, I'll showcase Oriza L Legrand. This is a brand that goes back all the way to the 1700s. King Louis XV is said to be the brand's first client, and the name of the brand is actually a nod to the Latin name for rice, Oriza sativa, and that's because rice powder was used in the original powders and cosmetics produced by the brand. Kind of interesting. This brand continued to thrive for years and years and years. The bottles were made from Baccarat crystal. They opened shops in Paris. They won awards at World's Fairs. Totally the works. And to my knowledge, the brand has never really actually gone dormant, but it is now under independent ownership. And those 2 gentlemen have committed to reviving some of the brand's most notable historical perfume creations. I love their heliotrope. It's an almondy, powdery floral. It very much gives you the rice powdery vibe that you would associate with a brand named after rice. And I also love their really interesting Relique d'Amour. That's a floral incense perfume. And their Chypre Mousse. Now that one is a very, very mossy green vegetal kind of perfume. And I don't know if this was the intention in calling it Chypre Mousse or if I'm just reading into it, but it actually does smell like air has been whipped into it. And finally, Santa Maria Novella. This is a brand I've talked about a fair amount on this channel. And this is another brand that I would not quite classify as a revival, as it's always kind of been around. It goes all the way back to the 1200s when a group of friars used botanicals for medicinal or healing purposes in Florence, Italy. And like most stories in history, when a wealthy person takes note, things start to happen because of the attention of a wealthy merchant, expanded into the construction of a chapel where the current flagship store still stands today. So fast forward to 1890, when the brand's owner established the brand's design, the vision, and a lot of the same details we see preserved in the brand today. And then in 2021, Santa Maria Novella was acquired by an Italian investment firm. And since then, they have launched two really, really successful and beautiful collections, the Eau de Cologne collection and then the Giardini de' Medici collection. My very, very favorite from Santa Maria Novella will probably always be Melograno. It is an intensely soapy scent that dries down to smell like mossy shaving cream. It is one of the most unusual soapy perfumes I've ever smelled, and since I am often drawn to the unusual, this seemed like a good fit for my collection, and it is one that I absolutely love wearing. And then, of course, if you love vintage, sometimes you do not have to look any further than the discounters or the gray market to find perfumes that have been around for decades in their most current iterations. You will hear people, even me, lamenting current formulations as being like ghosts of their former selves, and that can be true. But here's how I see it. If you have a particular affinity for a long-standing perfume, a vintage perfume, because it holds some kind of nostalgia or memory or meaning for you, then probably only the original formulation or the one that you connect with most deeply is going to do it for you. These are the perfumes that I personally searched for vintages of because there was just something missing from the current formulations for me. It didn't mean they were bad. Often they were actually good, but that little something, that like secret sauce was missing, kind of like the difference between looking at a photo of a memorable moment and actually reliving the moment in real time. So vintage perfumes almost give us that opportunity to relive a moment in real time. But the current formulations can be like that photo, the closest thing you can get to the moment in itself. And that can also be really, really good, especially if the vintage is hard to find or risky to source or out of reach cost-wise. Like I will give you an example. Anais Anais from Cacharel holds extremely deep meaning for me. But as a white floral, that one is a little risky to seek out in vintage form because often delicate notes like citrusy top notes and florals, they can degrade over time. And to me, the current formulation smells amazing. So that is a perfume that I would gladly keep in photograph form in my collection rather than roll the dice on chasing vintage. So here I have bottles of Giorgio Beverly Hills and Oscar de la Renta, perfumes that I wore and enjoyed in the 80s, but they aren't like embedded deeply into my soul. So the current formulations work perfectly for me. And finally, I would say if you are absolutely sure that you want to find a vintage bottle, these are some of my tips for buying vintage. Number one, be patient. Don't act on impulse. Take it from me. The minute I saw that Nikki de Saint Fall bottle at a fairly reasonable price, I just jumped on it and immediately bought it. And then it ended up being a waste of money because the perfume was not good. So be patient. Don't act on impulse. Don't click buy now. Ask questions of the seller. Ask how the perfume has been stored. Ask them if they know anything about the history of the perfume. Ask where it came from. Most vintage sellers will be more than happy to answer those questions for you. Number two, read reviews about the seller. Look to see if they are frequently selling vintage perfumes or if this seems to be a one-off in their listings. My third tip is to go to antique shops, estate sales, thrift stores. Often you will find lots of vintage perfumes in those places. And the great thing is you will be able to smell them to find out if they're any good. I went to an antique shop. They had a vintage bottle of Dior Poison. It's one of the vintages that is still missing from my collection, even though I do have the current formulation of that perfume to kind of like hold me over. When I sprayed it, two things: the atomizer was completely broken, and so the perfume just kind of like trickled out rather than sprayed out. And when I smelled it, I could tell there was something off about it. And so I ended up leaving that one behind. But from the same seller, I found a perfect bottle of vintage Liz Claiborne. So you never know what you're going to find at an antique shop, an estate sale, a thrift store. So you just have to be a little bit cautious and definitely patient when you are seeking vintage, unless it's something that's within a price range that you are comfortable blind buying. In which case, I say take a chance on a surprise. Could be good, could be bad, but if it's within your price range that you're comfortable with, I've done that too. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And so even if all of those tips still leave you feeling a little unsure about buying vintage, I hope you might think about trying some of these wonderful brands in this video that are making vintage style perfumes that you can sample and try before you buy. Of course, in this video, I could not possibly cover every single brand that is making amazing perfumes in a vintage style. So if you have any recommendations, please tell us in the comments so that we can add them to this list. Let's hive mind it. Let's get some more suggestions out there for those of us who love a good vintage style perfume and would like to see what perfumers today are doing to keep some of the vintage style perfumes alive. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for spending your time here with me. And thank you for chatting perfumes with me in the comments and for all of your fantastic recommendations. I hope you have a really great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.